Well, thank you very much, everyone. And, it's a real pleasure to be here. And firstly, congratulations to Australia winning the World Cup. Unfortunately, I do go back to the country, to South Africa with slight disappointment. However, still having the protest close to the hearts. But I think the real reason that we are here is that I firstly respect you in attending this talk, in that you're trying to make efforts in trying to promote a healthy lifestyle. And firstly, I think it wouldn't be possible without the support of my siblings throughout my life. And the support that they've given me is really invaluable. And I would really like to thank Habib and the team of UMSLD for putting on this event. And I know they've put a lot of effort into doing this right now. In addition to this, I think this great man, Professor Timothy Noakes, some of you would know, he's been outstanding in the works of nutrition and lifestyle. And he's currently my mentor and Ph.D. supervisor looking at cricket. And he's motivated a lot of us to think differently. And I think when it comes to the sciences of health and nutrition, we need to really do that. So what's on the menu today? So firstly, what we're going to be looking at is the power of the mind behind health. Secondly, the influence of modern era technology on our health. Thirdly, I think a lot of you, why you've come, the science behind low-carb, healthy fat diets and the misconceptions of it. And lastly, the correlation between physical activity, sport performance, weight loss, and obesity. So firstly, if you have to go into Google and search for a healthy lifestyle, what you'd find is more than 91 million results showing you what actually encapsulates a healthy lifestyle. And there's opinions and views showing you of what you should do and what you shouldn't do. So at the end of the day, what's the take-home message? So it leaves a lot of us confused, or it leaves a lot of us with questions that needs to be addressed. So we can think of a variety of principles that actually govern a healthy lifestyle, and these can vary from nutrition to physical activity, sport, eating correctly, your mindset, different types of education and occupation, and these are the primary things that actually governs a healthy lifestyle in addition to other variables. And then you'll see a lot of the books that have been published around a healthy lifestyle, and that shows them what you should do. And the challenge with this is that a lot of the books which are published are based on the author's views and expressions of what something should constitute of, and lacks the scientific rigor of a peer-reviewed journal. And therefore, we need to try and alleviate one of those misconceptions. So it's interesting to look at how far we have come after thousands of years of health and medicine prescription. And firstly, to take you a bit back and with lots of reading, in 1050 BC, the diagnostic handbook was based on a logical set of assumptions, including the modern view that through the examination and inspection of the symptoms of the patient, it is possible to determine the patient's disease, its etiology or its cause, future development, and the chances of the patient's recovery. And so the symptoms and diseases of the patient were treated through therapeutic means such as bandages, herbs, and so forth. So that was the first diagnostic handbook that was used in medicine. And then in 700 BC, we had the first known Greek medical scholar which opened in 700, and this guy was known as Alcanion. And what he did is that he did a lot of anatomical work behind medicine. And he worked at the school, and it was here that the practice of observing patients was established. And as the case elsewhere, the ancient Greeks developed a humoral medicine system where treatment sought to restore the balance of humors within the body. So that's what he looked at. It was the essence of humors. And then if we jump through to 400 BC, as we know, the guy who was very well known in Greece, Hippocrates, and that's where the physicians and medical specialists today take the Hippocratic Oath when they graduate. It was because of the heavy influence that Hippocrates had. And he said that it's still relevant and in use today, but he began to categorize illnesses as acute, chronic, endemic, epidemic, and also used terms such as exacerbation, relapse, resolution, paroxysm, peak, and convalescence. And when this had started, medicine had then evolved for a lot of the years. So if we have to jump another 2,000 years and go to the 16th to the 18th century, this was a crucial period because this was during the Renaissance era. And this brought an intense focus on scholarship to Christian Europe. And a major effort of this was to translate the Arabic and Greek scientific works into Latin, which later emerged. And the Europeans gradually became experts not only in the ancient writings of the Romans and the Greeks, but in the contemporary writings of Islamic scientists. And during the later centuries of the Renaissance came an increase in experimental investigation, and particularly in the field of dissection, body examination, and therefore advancing our knowledge in human anatomy. So as you can see, it's evolved thoroughly in a lot of those years from different types of tribes and different types of religious and spiritual cults. And then in the 18th century, there was also something called an alternative medicine. And one of the examples of alternative medicines which arose from the Middle East, particularly in India, was known as Unani medicine. And what Unani medicine was about is about to getting the deep roots in royal patronage during the medieval era. And it progressed during the Indian Sultanate and medieval periods. And Unani medicine is also very close to a different type of alternative medicine which is called Ayurveda, and both are based on the presence of the elements. So in Unani, examples of it are like fire, water, earth, and air. And according to the followers of Unani medicine, these elements are present in different fluids where their balance leads to health and their imbalance leads to illness. So in terms of the human body, it's about always having things in a state of balance or equilibrium. And then later in the 18th century, there was a guy called Sanskrit, which made the medical wisdom, and that dominated for a number of years. And the Muslim rulers built large hospitals in Hyderabad and Delhi in 1595 and 1719 respectively, and numerous commentaries on the ancient texts were then translated and written. And in the 19th century, medicine was then revolutionized in life, and in the 19th century beyond by advances in chemistry and laboratory techniques, and old ideas of infectious diseases and epidemiology were replaced with bacteriology and virology, and therefore we have students studying a bachelor's degree in biochemistry and even bacteriology. And later on, the healing included both physical and spiritual therapeutics, such as the right herbs, a suitable diet, clean bedding, and the sense of care that was always at hand. And other procedures used to help patients included the prayers, which was from a spiritual perspective, the relics of saints, and music needed to calm the troubled mind or a quickened pulse. And furthermore, there was also little development after the medieval era, and major European treatises on medicine took 200 years to reach the Middle East. So from all these translations into the various scriptures, it took 200 years to come there. And once it approached the Middle East, local rulers might consult with Western doctors to get the latest treatments. But the medical works were usually in Arabic, Turkish, and Persian as late as 1800, and this was based on medieval Islamic medicine. And that's why there was a lot of translation and written scriptures from these works. And then lastly, in the 20th century, as we can see now, the decline in many of the most lethal diseases was most due to improvements in public health and nutrition rather to medicine. And it was not until the 20th century that the application of the scientific method to medical research began to produce multiple important developments in medicine, but then later on with great advances in pharmacology and surgery. So the take-home message from this slide is that we first emerged with alternative medicine in the form of spiritual energy, diet, and mindset, and later evolved in terms of prescription medication into pharmacology and then surgery. So we need to differentiate between lifestyle and medicine. And a lot of the time we use these two terms interchangeably. And firstly, we have a lot of different types of treatments, from conventional treatment which are prescribed by medical doctors or specialists, conservative treatments which eradicates the use of invasive procedures, or alternative treatment which is used, which actually comprises from the earlier centuries. And lifestyle disease, it's important to know that these can be preventative, whereas medicine is therefore needed for illnesses and treatment. So it's important for us that we bridge the gap between the need for medicine or lifestyle modification. So the question to you, as both doctors and as the general population, what pill do you prescribe or utilize? Are you using the actual pill for medicine, or are you using your lifestyle or physical activity as the pill? And that's the decision that we need to make in order to utilize it as a treatment or in managing your illness. So let's go on to the first thing of the menu, and that is the power of the mind behind health. Now the power of the mind of the health is crucial, and I'd like to iterate that your mind is the engine of the car. All right? What you feed it in the sensory, verbal, visual, or physical perspective has a very high impact on what happens with regards to your mind. Now what happens, we know that the central nervous system is a critical proportion of the entire nervous system. And this is controlled by the hypothalamus in the body. So whatever we are doing in terms of our actions, whether it's being verbal, sensory, visual, or physical, this is controlled. So for example, when we're eating, it's controlled by the appestat. So if you see a cake on the table, if you see something very close, or for example, if your appetite is decreasing, that's controlled by something called the appestat. So the mind that plays in health is crucial. And I like to use the engine of a car, but usually a car is an example of that because it's not physiologically similar to the human body, but the concept is easier to understand. So similarly with health, are we actually producing the minor or the major services to our body? And the minor services can be eating correctly, or it can be physical activity. But the major service is, what is our lifestyle from a day-to-day basis? And that's the question that I want to leave you if you're going today. And then secondly, let's use an example. So energy comes in a variety of forms. So energy can come in the form of food, it can come in different sense. So for example, one of the first forms of energy is spiritual energy, and that can come from the sun, or from physical energy as well, or kinetic energy. It also comes from the sun. So let's take an example of someone who's doing a triathlon, or who's doing a run, who is preparing for a marathon. He's basically preparing for this marathon, and he's running towards a certain mile or for a certain distance. And usually we say, if you are running or exercising in temperatures of more than 25 degrees Celsius, there's a chance that you can get dehydrated, and therefore you need to suck up on the liquids. So the physiology behind the dehydration says that there's amino acids we are joined together via dehydration reaction. So what we'd see over here is that you've got something in physics called the carboxyl group together with an amino group. And when you are exercising, what happens is that your body has a loss of water to compensate for the amount of energy and heat that it dissipates. So there's a loss of energy, and therefore they say, in order, because of the loss of water that you have, you therefore need to replace those liquids or those electrolytes. So, partly true, but what we really need to remember is that if we are getting dehydrated, right, we are feeling a sense of tiredness, sluggishness, fatigue, and in most circumstances, if you are not having certain liquids, right, we are getting dehydrated. Now, based on according to research that we've seen, this is entirely incorrect. Okay. And that a lot of the things that we have been taught, especially in the exercise physiology of running, or even in terms of drinking to thirst, or in terms of drinking according to guideline, is that it caters for a generic one-size-fits-all approach. So what happened is that what they've shown is that the central governor, which was also promoted by Professor Timothy Noakes, shows that the hypothalamus together with the brain promotes everything that occurs in the body, and therefore your mind controls your physiological processes. So for example, if you're going in for a run, you can have two mindsets. You can say, you can go out there for a run and you're going to say, I'm going to get dehydrated, therefore I've got to keep the water on me because physiologically I'm going to get dehydrated. From a spiritual sense, or from a different mindset, you can say that the sun is giving me a sense of energy, and therefore I'm going to tell myself to hydrate a few weeks before the race, and during the race I'll be okay. So you've got a lot of these companies promoting drinks like Powerade, Gatorade, and Energade, saying that you've got to replace your electrolytes. So the take-home message is that when you are in physical activity or under excruciating dehydration, the fact is you just need water. That's all you need. Because when you combine the carboxyl group and the amino group, you have a loss of water, not electrolytes. And therefore, the dehydration is not as hectic as it seems. So another take-home message is that your mind is a critical factor for your health, and that controls your physiological processes. So another interesting thing is homeostasis. So if we backtrack to the previous slide, we noticed that if someone was in balance, they had good health. If someone was in imbalance, they had illness. And homeostasis, the scientific terminology of that is that your body's physiological state comes to an equilibrium or balance. And we can take an example of this man over here, also in the sun. He is comfortable, his body temperature is within a range of about 37 degrees, and the body thermoregulation sensors and receptors are optimal. So if he goes out for a run, what happens is that his thermoregulation and body temperature go up. So what his body has to do is adapt so much that he has to go out of his homeostasis to bring it back to a state of homeostasis. So same thing if you are training on a very high altitude or very cold environments, your temperature can drop, and therefore your body is going to dissipate heat in order to return it back to its optimum. So not just with physical activity, but with eating and even with mindsets, what your body does, if it goes out the state of homeostasis, there's a lot of adaptation that the body needs. And if it's doing adaptation under a critical state, so for example, if you're exerting yourself, or if you have less sleep, or if you're out of the confinements of a balance, it has to do a lot of adaptation, and that's when you have a burnout, and that's when you go below your immune system. So in health, it's all about returning your body to a level of homeostasis. So on to the second topic, the influence of modern era technology on our health. And as we are living into the 21st century, does technology have a positive or a negative influence on our health? So let's think differently. So there's two different lifestyles, and I saw a lot of us can relate to this, related to the past and to the present. So first, in the early era, there were a lot of activities of daily living, and the diet or the eating lifestyle were different. And that a lot of us used to cook in the past eras. And when I mean the past or the early eras, I'm talking about before, after 1900s, but before 1960s. So the activities of daily living were evident. The healthy lifestyle that we used to do were much more better. There were less takeaways, there were less restaurants. The mindset and attitude towards a more physical lifestyle was a bit better than today. So the question is, why is this done? Well, in the modern era, what happens is that our diet has taken a complete U-turn, and that we have more drive-thrus, we've got more foods being offered through a small square window, we've got more options from industries offering carbohydrates and sugar, and the diet has been completely different compared to the earlier era. And these are also in the process of processed foods and also mobility. So for example, if we want to get something from a restaurant, we can drive instead of walking. So the physical inactivity has increased. If you want to get something in terms of diet or cooking, we're not actually walking there, we're sending an SMS, we've got Mr. Delivery, we've got different types of communication in order to access the food. So the mobility is convenient, but it's detrimental to our health. And then physical activity is very important. So we're utilizing the different types of transport modes, for example, the train, the car, plane. Those are convenient, but that's where we've got to balance it out in terms of our healthy lifestyle. So transport modes in terms of walking or cycling, excellent, right? But is it convenient if you want to get to somewhere far? No. Urbanization, which relates to the built environments that we are around us. So is the built environment very friendly or conducive to what we would like to do? And for some of the communities that we reside in, built environments may not be conducive to what we want to do. And the second aspect is attitude. So you get different types of people. So we'll say we need more motivation to exercise. And unfortunately, in the prehistoric times, there were dinosaurs that could chase us. But right now, we need something else to motivate us to keep on doing exercise and physical activity. And instead of saying I'm calling it fit tomorrow, you rather say I'm calling it fat tomorrow. So those are the differences in attitudes that we have. Behavior, I'm sure some of you have seen this, but doctors are telling the patients, what fits your busy schedule better? Exercising 1 hour a day or being dead 24 hours a day? And that is something that you need to ask yourselves. And lastly, you get two types of people. They can either say, don't exercise, eat all you want, and probably die early. Or you can get someone else saying, exercise daily, count calories, merely wish you were dead. So we got two different types of behaviors and two different types of people who can advocate for something else. So let's go through the science behind it. So the question is, are we as lazy as the Libyan flag? And that's the flag of Libya. So we really need to ask ourselves there, in terms of sedentary behavior, we need to get off our seats and start to being physically active, because technology has its advantages, but it also has its disadvantages. So I want to show you something, and if we could reduce the world's population to a village of precisely 100 people, with all existing human ratios remaining the same, what would the demographics look like? So let's first look at the demographics. Firstly, you look at about 60 Asians, 12 Europeans, 5 US Americans and Canadians, 8 Latin Americans, and 14 Africans. 49 would be female, where 51 would be male. 82 would have dark skin color, whereas 18 would have light skin color. 89 would be heterosexual, 11 would be homosexual. 80 out of the 100 would be living in substandard housing. 24 of the 100 would not have electricity, and of that 24, 76% that do have electricity, most would only use it for light at night. 67 out of the 100 would be unable to read. Only 1 out of 100 would have a college education. 50 out of 100 would be malnourished, and 1 dying of starvation. And 33 out of 100 would be without access to safe water supply. 1 out of 100 would have HIV. 1 out of 100 would be near death. 2 out of 100 would be near birth. And 7 out of 100 people would have access to the internet. In Africa, this ratio is reversed. So the morbidity to birth ratio is actually 2 to 1. And in most of the other countries in the Commonwealth nations, the morbidity to birth ratio is 1 to 2. But these are the statistics that we sit at. So the question is technology having an impact of what's actually occurring with the statistics behind each of the sectors within the general population? So moving on, despite the technology being a critical factor and a challenge, eating is also something which is very critical. And I think there's a lot of emphasis at the moment that has been placed on eating. So therefore we're going to look at the science behind it. And firstly, let's take you through of how far we've actually come after 100 years of nutrition prescription. Where firstly, between 1900 and 1947, there was something called the native diet. And that was started in India when the British had colonized parts of India, which was known as the British East India Company. And the native diet had started between that time. And close to 1920 is when malnourishment, especially amongst children, had started. And that was because of the pandemic of the lack of minerals that they were accessing, especially after they had gained their independence during those times. So then the Western era, or the Western part of the world, saw this as a big public health challenge, and therefore they said we need to address this. So one of the first types of images that had come through, or the strategies that had come through in 1946, was something called the Basic 7. So they say the Basic 7, eat this way every day. So it's 1 to 7. So what you've got leafy green and yellow vegetables, you've got citrus fruit, you've got potatoes, you've got milk, cheese and ice cream, so you've got the dairy produce, you've got your meat and poultry, your bread and cereals, and then you've even got your butter. And as you can see, they said, eat this way every day and have it in moderation. So there's an equal part of it. So as it's going on, we later saw that there's been an increase in heart disease, there's been an increase in non-communicable disease and certain morbidities, and therefore they said, hang on, we need to change this. So I'd like to give you a description or a correlation between why a salad costs more than a Big Mac. In 2005, they did the study, and this was done by both the food production and the nutritional recommendation. So the nutritional recommendation is stated, and you guys are probably familiar with the pyramid, that your grains are probably higher than your vegetables and fruit, and your vegetables and fruit are higher than your protein and than your sugar. However, the food production had showed that the meat and dairy costed much more, the grains costed a bit less, and the vegetables and fruits and nuts and legumes had costed even lesser. So therefore it was easier for a lot of the companies to actually sell things such a food as a Big Mac or certain takeaway foods, and it was more expensive and also agriculturally difficult for them to make a salad. And that's why, not just for example between a salad and a Big Mac, but if you go to any type of shop, yes, it's more expensive to have a more healthy lifestyle instead of this. So if the industries are offering something which are cheaper but unhealthier, okay, and you have the healthy food, which is an expensive tool, and unfortunately the masses can't afford it. So then in 2006, the United States of Agriculture had produced the first pyramid, and we all know this. And this was one of the first food pyramids, as it said, and this was the guideline that each one of us had to follow in terms of a few servings per day and what's required of a balanced diet. And in 2011, the revised edition of the pyramid came in, and this was called as the My Pyramid. So it wasn't exactly like a pyramid, but it was actually a triangle which showed a fairly consistent moderation, but slightly, like for example, milk, especially full cream milk, was on a minority, it was of a minor utilization, where a lot of the others were quite consistent. So they pay emphasis on grains, vegetables, fruits, milk, meat, and beans. So where are we right now in 2015? Well, I've done a bit of research, especially in Australia, and I see the Australian guidelines are quite strict. The advantage of the Australian guideline to healthy eating is that everything there is in moderation. However, you've got a lot of the vegetables and you've got a lot of the grains and the carbohydrates of the majority, where the others are for minority. So while it's good that everyone is having things in moderation, in that they're trying to promote a consistent diet, the disadvantage of that is that we're actually having more carbohydrates than what we should be having in terms of full cream milk and meat and produce. So that's how far we've come, and because of that, a lot of the well-known artists from a scientific peer-reviewed rigor have produced a lot of books. And these books have been published in order to show the different ways in which we're eating. Now, as you can see, there's a lot of diets that have been prescribed in different types of books. Ketogenic to Atkins, paleo, and then lately, these 3 books have come out: the paleo diet, good calories, bad calories, and then Karen Thompson's sugar-free diet. These 3 books actually addresses the epidemic and the real challenge in obesity and nutrition worldwide. So the question is, which diet do you follow? Because each one of the authors are actually advocating for a different type of diet. But the real reason is that, as I said before, there is no one-size-fits-all approach. And therefore, each individual will cater for a different type of diet specific to them. But there is the best book that has come so far, and which has changed millions and hundreds of thousands of lives around the world, with the low-carb, high-fat diet. And that is Tim Noakes' Real Revolution. So there's a lot of conspiracy behind this, and to say that if you're having a lot of fats, that's unhealthy. How can you have fats? So personally, I feel that they should actually switch the terminology between fats and carbohydrates around, because if you tell someone carbohydrates, they'll say, well, okay. If you say fats, they say, no, we can't have fats, that's not good. Right? So it's the education behind that. So if you look at the epidemic of health, we would see that in 1995, that the calorie intake was much more higher. So the more yellow it is, the more calorie intake you're having. So Australia, in 1995, had more than 3,000 calories per day, which is huge for the average person. And if you look at other countries like the United States of America or even in Russia, they had a lot of calories. If you back forth into 2001 to 2003, it got even worse. So we didn't even see any white or any light yellow colors. Now we're seeing different primary colors. And that it actually went worse to orange. So it was more than 3,000 calories. The USA is probably one of the most obese countries right now, and they've got calorie intakes of more than 3,400. So the calories have just been increased, and the physical activity has just decreased. And this has been promoted by a variety of brands within the food industry. And if you look at the food industry in this slide over here, you notice that a lot of them are advocating for sugar or carbohydrates. And these are the leading food industries which are in the market. And therefore, it's limiting the choices for the consumers to consume something which is much more viable for their health. And the hard truth is that people are fed by the food industry, which pays no attention to health, and are treated by the health industry, which pays no attention to food. And therefore, the gap needs to be bridged between health and food, in that hospitals and the nutrition market are not speaking to each other. They're actually facing their backs to each other. And that's something that would need to be changed via legislation, but it is a very big challenge. So the low carb is low fat, and if you look at it, Tribunal Council, then some of us would think that low fat is actually the way to go, or low carb is the way to go. Well, let's take you first to the basics of fats and carbs. 1 gram of fats gives you 9K calories, whereas carbohydrates, 1 gram of carbohydrates gives you 4K calories. Carbohydrates is known as a source of energy, where fats is known as the reserve source of energy. And latest research has shown that the body's preferred physiological source of energy is actually fats. It's not carbohydrates. So in order for you to understand, if you look at 1 gram, which is 9K calories, right? If you equivalent that of a low GI bread, and why do they say a low glycemic index produce is quite good? Because it keeps you fuller for longer and it lasts you over time. And that's exactly the same thing that fat does. However, if your fats are not utilized through physical activity, it does not get stored as fat. That's the biggest misconception. If your carbohydrates are not used with energy, the remaining amount of carbohydrates of energy then get converted into fatty acid and stores in the body as body fat. And that's the real misconception, that if you eat fat, you get fat. That's not true. Okay? So the recommended amounts, especially from the USA and Australia, said that we should actually focus on a 20 to 30% of our daily intake. And with latest research, we know that that is actually not true. And then they emphasize the importance that if you're having carbohydrates, make sure it's in moderation. So they give you something called the glycemic load. And a glycemic load is the amount of carbohydrates you have per glycemic index over 100. So your glycemic index shows the amount of carbohydrates can sustain you over time, but the glycemic load shows how much it can push it up. So even if you're trying to control your carbohydrates, if there's an excess amount of energy or carbohydrates that you are using, it's still going to get converted into fat. And obesity and overweight is one of the most leading epidemics in the health that we are facing today. And because of obesity, it is causing other type of epidemic diseases such as diabetes, insulin resistance, and heart disease. So if you look at the effects of carbohydrates, and this is just a simple diagram to show that the more carbohydrates you have, the more of a danger zone that you are. So effectively, if you're on the low carbohydrate diet, you should limit your carbohydrate restriction to less than 30 grams per day. So if you look at this, that's the ideal spot to be in. Because if you are there, you would burn more fat, and you have more weight loss in terms of maintaining a very good lifestyle. Where if you're going a bit forward, you notice that you're actually going to the state of overweight or even obesity, and that is actually much more. So we need to keep it under, preferably under 50 grams or within that bucket there. And that's the danger behind carbohydrate. So what's the verdict between saturated versus unsaturated fat? Now previous research has shown that unsaturated fat is actually the way to go, because saturated fat can actually promote heart disease. Latest research currently, just after 2012, has shown that it's a reversible effect, that saturated fats do not cause heart disease. And the real reason behind it is quite simple. Unsaturated fats contain a double bond within its chain, whereas a saturated fatty acid contains a single bond. So if we have to differentiate between saturated and unsaturated fats, we would see that the type of bond that saturated fats have is of a single bond, and an unsaturated fat is a double bond, which means that the unsaturated fats are much more dense in terms of nutrition. Carbohydrates, for example, your breads, your pastas, your rice, and even other carbohydrates which contain gluten, these are high dense types of food which stays in your body for longer, and that's why a lot of you would probably feel bloated after you have a rice or after you have certain breads and potatoes. And that's because it's very high dense. Now the same thing with unsaturated fat, because of the double bond, it is very high dense as opposed to saturated fat. So they thought if you have a lot of saturated fat, it's going to increase your cholesterol and therefore cause a blockage in your arteries and cause a heart attack. But there's no association between cholesterol and a heart attack. So research is yet to be done to find what is the cause that is causing atherosclerosis, which means there's a blockage of plaque within the arteries. And they've shown that the wall of the arteries is a critical factor of heart disease. So no matter how much cholesterol you have in the body, it makes no difference. So the wall of the arteries can be strengthened with exercise, and it can be strengthened with good nutrition. That's the focus. That's where it needs to be geared towards. So the amount of fats that you have does not promote heart disease. Sugar does. And so what they're looking at the differentiation between the two fats, they looked at the recommended consumption, the health effects, the cholesterol, and the commonly found, and where it is. And you'd see that the recommended consumption was 10% of saturated fats, where 30% was for unsaturated. The health effects showed that because of the association with atherosclerosis and heart disease, therefore you should have less of that. Research is showing it has nothing got to do with that, right? And therefore what it is that all of this that is comparing between saturated and unsaturated fats needs to be changed. So let's look at stats by country. So the percentage of overweight and obese adults with BMI is usually greater than 25. So if you have a BMI over 25, you are considered to be obese or overweight. And if we look at the stats by its country, between 1980 and 2008, over 28 years, these have substantially increased. And then if you look at saturated fat versus unsaturated fat by country as well, less saturated fat actually cause more heart disease, and more saturated fat cause less heart disease. So that means the more energy you are having from saturated fat, the better you are. And the less saturated fat that you're having, the more heart disease you are prone in those countries. And this was a recent study that was conducted. So at the end of the day, if you look at the Charvey Council, what do we look at? Do we go for low carb or do we go to high for low carb? And the hard truth is that anything that is worthy is difficult. And anything that is unworthy is very easy. So for example, it's very easy to have a chocolate cake or to have something that is very tasty, but it's not worthy. And it's very difficult to follow a diet or a health plan which is going to be good for you, but at the end of the day, it's going to be worthy for you. And my theory of that is that if it tastes sweet, it is probably better for your health. And that is something that you have to take home away today. Saturated fat does not cause disease, sugar does. And we are not overweight because we eat because we are overweight. And that's because your body needs to compensate for the amount of place that you have in you, and therefore you eat more instead of losing that amount of space. So, I'd like to show you a video. I'm not sure if it's going to play. Oh, well, it's not going to play. Alright, so let's go further to sugar addiction. There's another element that says that cancer feeds off sugar, and that's the latest research right now. That if the more sugar that you have, the more you are predisposed to developing cancer. And the hard truth is that sugar is more addictive than tobacco and cocaine put together. So we really need to curb the sugar addiction going forward, and that's how addictive it is. If you haven't had it for 2 weeks, it's very difficult to really quit it. And therefore, the power of the mind behind the health is critical, because you need to control your appestat. And your appestat is telling you to go for it, but you don't really need it. So it's an addictive behavior. So I'd like to share you a story of my friend. And Uzma is based in Joburg, and she had been diagnosed with cancer last year. And we actually been very good colleagues at the University of Johannesburg. It was quite a shock to a lot of us as youths that she had cancer. And she has a long story, and it gives us great privilege to be thankful to her that she would like to share her story. And this is what she says. She says that I live in a household where alternative medicine is always an option before conventional. So if you look at the history of medicine, alternative was always, especially in the indigenous areas. So in the end, I decided we will go through with chemotherapy and we'll do alternative therapy in conjunction with it. The alternative consisted of ozone therapy, hemp oil, green powders, whole squeezed lemons, dry dates, Zimzum water, high fiber diet, no sugars, no processed and refined foods, and Kulinji. And her opinion is that each of these items contributes to assisting to eradicate this dreadful disease, and not to forget to mention prayer. Prayer, she believes, from a spiritual sense, has really convinced and this biggest contributing factor. And right now, I heard about a week ago, just before I flew to Australia, that she's now in a state of remission. She's completely cured. She doesn't have cancer. And she told me, she says, the biggest factor that she feels amongst these was cutting out on sugar and carbohydrates completely. Because your cancer cells feed off sugar. If there's no sugar, your cancer cells die, and therefore they cannot be there. And what happened is she had ovarian cancer. She started from one stage, and it spread to stage 4, and it spread throughout the body. And they were saying, okay, and usually we know a lot of the patients who have cancer stage 4 is quite critical. And later on, she went for more checkups, and the cancer became more localized. And the gynecologist had told her that surgery could therefore be utilized in order to refrain it. So my personal journey, believe it or not, beginning of 2014, that's what I looked like. And it was a stressful year. And going according to this healthy eating plan, this is what I look like right now. And for me, you notice that I may have a bit of muscle bulk, but in fact it was actually more body fat percentage than anything else. And this is how I look right now, or you can see here for yourself. So lastly, very quickly, we just want to do the correlation between physical activity, sport performance, weight loss, and obesity. And this was a conference held in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. And what they found in this conference is that physical inactivity is the 4th leading risk factor for all-cause mortality. And they also found that standing time is better than sitting time. And you'd notice that all of these conference delegates right here are standing, because standing is better and sitting actually promotes sedentary behavior. So my question to you right now is, are you standing or sitting? And that's sedentary behavior. So if you look at the prevalence of physical activity worldwide, firstly in South Africa, we notice that it's in the bracket of 50 to 60%. In Australia, it's not that bad, it's between 30 to 39%, and that's because your environments are more conducive for physical activity, especially in those environments. However, in certain areas, it's still a critical factor for inactivity. So the World Health Organization estimates that about 2 million deaths are attributable to physical inactivity worldwide every year. More than 60% of men and nearly 50% of women are not achieving health-enhancing levels of physical activity. and between 10 to 12% of all premature mortality may be attributed to insufficient levels of physical activity in adult South Africans. And this was a cohort study from a consensus document, which is a South African National Health Examination Survey 2013, which showed the risk factors behind obesity and mortality, and showed that physical inactivity was the second leading risk factor after alcohol use. So it's a really pandemic. If you look at the challenging stats for the South African youth, 1 in 5 play sport. 2 in 5 smoke or consume drugs in terms of intoxication. 3 in 5 are physically inactive. And 4 in 5 are overweight. And South Africa is the leading country in sub-Saharan Africa for obesity. So it's really a challenging factor. So this is the Health 24 Fitness Expert Forum, and I've been serving on here for just more than 2 years. And I've compiled all of these questions that have been asked to me, and there have been more than 500 questions. And you won't believe it, about 240 of those questions have been asked to me in terms of weight loss. They want to know what exercises they should do in order to lose weight. They want to know what exercise to do in order to remove certain body fat percentage or certain love handles or certain areas in the body that they need to lose. The hard truth is that physical activity does not contribute to weight loss. Research has shown that. What it does is that it increases your metabolism, which helps in conjunction with a healthy lifestyle to lose the weight. But physical activity is good for sport performance, but in terms of weight loss, it contributes nothing. And therefore, most of the questions that I received pertain to weight management, because weight is a really challenging factor that needs to be addressed. And the real pull behind weight management is healthy lifestyle, and particularly a low carbohydrate diet. So this is a Biokinetic Humanitarian project which is started in South Africa, which is part of our NPO called Humanitarians. And what it does is that it wants to advocate for health education, and it actually involves exercise testing and exercise prescription in underprivileged communities. And we went to a variety of settings out there in order to alleviate this pandemic and also to provide education for why physical activity is quite important. So this was also done in the Deaf and Blind Society in KwaZulu-Natal, and both interventions had shown prolific results in terms of going forward, and it also appeared in the University of KwaZulu-Natal newsletter, and this also comprised of health education. With the recent epidemic of Ebola, especially in West Africa, this had to be educated on what it pertains to, diabetes, and even exercise. Now when you go out to these communities, they are not of an epidemic level, and therefore layman's terms is usually utilized to promote this health education. So we also went out to a Tranmere Football Club to promote sporting performance and showing what biokinetics is and how you can help them. And then papers were then published in the journals to show about certain interventions like this which are beneficial and how it can be replicated in a variety of settings worldwide. And there was another paper that was promoted in terms of senior university students that the conception is because you are young, you are healthy, but it actually, what the paper found is that it starts from a young age in order to go forward, and foundation is key. So talking about foundation moving forward in terms of healthy lifestyle, and especially on the NPO that we're doing right now, welcome aboard on the plane of the Biokinetic Humanitarian Project. And in 2014 we started very well on the ground, and right now going towards 2016 we've kind of lifted off with some improvement, but the real ultimate goal is that in 2020 we're hoping to soar a bit higher, where we can even come to the shores of Australia and collaborate maybe with UNSLV and other organizations in order to make this difference. And in order to do this, the foundation of any type of intervention on a challenging factor is critical, and that's key. And that's why if your foundation is not set in stone, a skyscraper and a building is completely different. So in conclusion, the main challenges which are needed to be addressed in the world is not just Africa, is public health, physical inactivity, education, sustainability. I promise you that's not Barack Obama. And the economy and living. So your take-home message today is that legislation and education are needed in every country in order to administer the changes which are needed. And sugar is not the poison. Sorry, sugar is the poison, not fat. Fat is not the poison. And physical activity doesn't assist with weight loss. What it does is it increases your metabolism, it improves your sports performance, but what does promote your weight loss is your low carbohydrate eating lifestyle. The mind is the most underestimated director of the entire body, and therefore a lot of emphasis needs to be placed on it. And technology, I like to call it, is like water. It can either be advantageous or it can be detrimental to you. And if it's not used carefully, that's where it's a disadvantage. I'm not sure that the video of Bruce is going to play, but he clearly sums up of how you should be of being water, and I really can't say best as how he does. And I'm sorry that the video is not working. So the real thing is that the eating and the healthy eating lifestyle is the elephant in the room, where the choices that you make, that's the lion in the jungle. And that's what you need. The choices that you make are critical, but your lifestyle needs to advocate to low carbohydrate if you want to prevent surgery. So be the catalyst for change in order to remove these choices. And the irony of age is that a child has energy and time, but no money. An adult has energy and money, but no time. And the elderly folk, and even those who are in retirement, have time and money, but no energy. So the real reason is that you're trying to bridge the gap of having one or two out of the three, because if you have all three, you actually consider yourself privileged, and that's the irony of age. And hardship is designed to make you stronger, not weaker. Easy is designed to make you weaker, not stronger. So remember that anything worthwhile is going to be difficult. If you see the chocolate cake, it's very easy, therefore it's not worth it. And nothing is impossible. Remember, the word itself says, I'm impossible. And in sciences, we can be the enemies in debate, but we are the compatriots in action. We are the compatriots in terms of moving forward. And therefore, to achieve action, correct action starts with correct thinking, and correct thinking starts with the correct mindset and the power of the mind. Let's take action. Thank you very much.